This is Entering Tyngsborough. I'm Rony Camille. Happy New Year. In this episode, we're talking about the financial health of the town. Earlier this January, Town Manager Colin Loiselle presented an initial look at the fiscal 27 budget before the select board. Now, as the numbers came into focus, it became clear that this wasn't just an early budget check-in. The town is looking at a real gap and a budget this season that will require some important decisions. Now, before we hear from Colin, here's a brief moment from that meeting, and it captures the tone of that room and the implications of the budget for fiscal 27. Let's take a listen.
Obviously, the key is going to be understanding which ones we're contractually obligated to versus, which ones we have some factors.
And that was select person Eric Eldridge. Mr. Town Manager, Happy New Year. Welcome back to Tyngsborough's Front Porch.
Happy New Year. Thanks for having me.
So let's just dive in. When you think about the financial health of Tyngsborough, how do you define that? And using that definition, how would you describe the town right now, where it's at?
Sure. I think that Tyngsborough is in many ways like our peer communities. The cost, as people see in their own personal lives and in business, the cost of everything is increasing at a rate that generally far exceeds the revenue that municipalities are bringing in. So our health is better than better than many other communities are, but certainly we're facing a lot of the same challenges. We heard from Mr. Eldridge at our last select board meeting. That's the meeting where I shared that we were looking at a projected deficit for fiscal year 2027. And a deficit is a scary word. You hear it a lot oftentimes when you talk about the federal government. But really what it means is that our expenditures are expected to outpace the revenue. Fortunately, we're looking at a $2 million deficit, which although $2 million certainly is a large number, compared to our $55 million budget, right, that's not a huge number. And so it's a number that will work toward decreasing because we have to present a balanced budget to town meeting in May. But every other indicator of our financial health is positive. We have strong reserves. We have a great bond rating, which helps us borrow at decent interest rates. But we're contending with what many of our peer communities began contending with 4 or 5 years ago, which is state aid hasn't kept up with the cost of inflation. Prop 2.5 limits how much our tax levy can increase by 2.5%. And as a smaller community in the region, we tend to see less in the way of large economic development, which helps boost that levy than some of our peers along Route 3. All in all, we will get to a balanced budget, right? So, presenting a deficit to the select board kind of comes off as a little scary. The reality is we're outlining that we've got some tough decisions to make over the course of the next few months. We'll make them, and town meeting in May will absolutely see a balanced budget.
I feel like your answer just summed up the entire podcast, and we could just wrap it up and walk.
I'm efficient, Rony. I'm efficient.
You are very efficient. But you mentioned the deficit. Is this a one-year issue? Is this that's something that's kind of a longer term? How did we get here?
Yeah, so it's a first-year issue for us. One of the things that I talked about at the select board's meeting was the difference between the deficit that we're facing for fiscal year 27 and structural deficits. If you look at literally every single one of the communities that borders us, with the exception of the city of Lowell, they've all been having the deficit conversation for at least 3 fiscal years, right? Some cases it's more. In those circumstances, it's fair to describe them as structural deficits because it's a persistent imbalance of revenue and expenditures. Fortunately for us, we're late to the party. This is the first fiscal year that we've encountered a projected deficit. And there are a multitude of factors. We talked about the challenges of stagnant and in some cases declining state aid. Meanwhile, the cost to hire people is increasing. The cost to pay bills is increasing. So I'm not saying that Tyngsborough is going to be back to roses and sunshine next year, but I think that there are important things we can do this fiscal year that will set us up for success. And so, I told the select board that I don't believe we're in a structural deficit. Certainly, if next year we're facing the same conversation, I might have to rethink that assessment. But we're at an inflection point where we now need to make very tough decisions about how we proceed and continue to emphasize the need for the state to fund municipalities consistent with inflation. Sort of off topic, but a few meetings ago, the select board signed on to a letter of support that we sent to the legislature And one of the things that we look at differently here in Tyngsborough is if you look across the Commonwealth, there are a lot of municipalities arguing for a repeal or an amendment to the Prop 2.5 law.
So, and I know you're mid-thought, but for somebody that is listening for the first time or is not familiar with Prop 2,
Yeah.
what is Prop 2?
Prop 2.5 is a law that was passed in the 80s that said that a municipal levy, the amount we can tax our collective resident, is limited to a 2.5% increase every year, plus new growth. So when you think about new growth, you think about large projects that come online in the middle of a fiscal year, you experience a one-time boost to your levy limit. But generally speaking, your levy limit from last year increases by 2.5. There are ways around it. For instance, in other communities, and not in Tyngsborough, I want to be abundantly clear, this is not on the table in Tyngsborough, but there are communities that go for Prop 2.5 overrides, and that allows the municipality, by vote of town meeting and the election, to increase the levy limit above 2.5. Tyngsborough, that's not on the table. What we said to the state was, Prop 2.5 places an unfair burden on cities and towns. The amount of money that the state collects every year is certainly not limited by any percentage. Every year, they're able to put money into rainy day funds, which is important. But what it demonstrates is they continue to collect more than enough money to operate state government without increasing local aid, although last year they did increase Chapter 90 specific for roads, so we won't factor that in. And then they leave it to the cities and towns to say, hey, we can't fund our basic operations. We've got to lay off teachers. We've got to lay off police officers unless you let us tax you more. Our argument is simple. We believe the state collects enough revenue every year to just increase state aid so that we don't have to be the ones going to taxpayers and saying, hey, you've got to pay more. Because what I've said in every budget cycle I've been in charge of since coming back to Tyngsborough is we can only get from residents what they can afford to give.
Correct.
The question of how much people can pay in taxes isn't I don't want to pay anymore. Most people don't want to. But for a lot of people, it's, hey, listen, I've got nothing else to give. Maybe I've given up this particular pleasure item because I've got to pay the bills. And so we just want the state to recognize that and use the money they've already had to help cities and towns. And if that happened, the Mass Municipal Association published a report a couple weeks ago that basically said, had the state kept up with inflation from a state aid perspective, they would be putting $351 million a year more into cities and towns. They call it the 351 for 351. If the legislature made that decision this year, we would be having a totally different conversation, and municipalities could live within the Prop 2.5 limits.
351 for the 351 communities in the Commonwealth. Got
Absolutely.
it. Besides the state aid, which you've now said that you're not a big fan of how it's structured, what are some of the other bigger factors, that are, largely outside the town's control?
Certainly, we are not immune from the pressures that the healthcare industry is facing. Specifically, one of our biggest budget drivers in fiscal year 27 is a 25% increase in health insurance. 25%. That represents about a $1.3 million increase. When you look at our projected revenue, that's barely enough to cover the increase in health insurance alone. Last year, we saw a 17% increase. And this isn't unique to Tyngsborough. If you get your insurance through a private plan, if you get it through your spouse who works somewhere else, you're seeing increases as well. 25% is a really big one. That's a big driver. We're a small community. We've got limited land. And so we're running out of places to develop. And
Right.
so we're not seeing as much new growth.
And so what sort of options does the town have can they negotiate with the health insurance companies to say, hey, listen, we can't do 25. Can you do 10?
Certainly not to the extent you've portrayed, Rony, although I wish one day you're in charge of a health insurance company. What we're doing is we've brought on a consultant separate from our current healthcare provider who is going to put together a request for proposals to really help us solicit rates for a community our size from the marketplace. And while in all reality, Tyngsborough likely couldn't switch for fiscal year 27, there's too many upfront costs, that will give us a bit of a leveraging point to go back to our health insurance provider and say, hey, listen, if we made the switch to X carrier, we would be able to see, a savings of X percent and hopefully bring that 25% down. Even 2 or 3 points would help. Now, long term, we've already begun the conversation and we'll continue to work with our employees on this about looking at what a long-term solution is. There are very limited options for a municipality. You can create your own trust, which is incredibly financially challenging. You've got to come up with, $7 or $8 million just on day one to create the pot of money you'll pay claims out of. So that's not feasible for Tyngsborough. There are regional health trusts, but they're largely collapsing. Tyngsborough left one in 2017. That collapsed a couple years ago. There are a handful, probably 2 or 3 strong ones that remain out in the Berkshires and down on the Cape. So that's not really an option for Tyngsborough. So the real only remaining option is to switch to the Group Insurance Commission, which is a state-run plan, provides health insurance to state employees, and also every year to a growing number of cities and towns. Their rate increases are certainly smaller than the 25%. Unfortunately, making a change like that is about a fiscal year and a half out, so we'd see the potential savings in fiscal year 28. So that's what we're looking to do. It's not an immediate pressure relief, but it's something that we're working with a professional on and hopefully our employees to make a plan that is suitable. Because remember, it's not every penny that we're spending on top of the rates this year, every increase we see, our employees are seeing on their paycheck as well. So it's in everyone's best interest to find a plan that's more sustainable.
Besides the healthcare, any other big pieces that are part of this conversation?
Yeah, property insurance has gone up. You know, we just completed a state-of-the-art new middle school under budget, roughly $2.4 million under budget, which is unheard of these days. But we replaced a crumbling old building with an $84 million, that number's not correct, that's what we got town meeting for, it's less than that, but an $80 million brand new building. So our property insurance, of course, increased. And on top of that, we're in year 2 now of the $900,000 contribution from the general fund to the middle school debt.
Pay back the debt.
And that was a commitment that the select board, the finance committee, and school committee made several years ago, where for the 30 years of the loan on the middle school, the general fund would contribute $1 million. $900,000 comes from the budget you see at town meeting. $100,000 comes from the revenue from the Lakeview school lease. And the schools agreed to only increase their budget by 2.7%. So that $900,000, if you think about it, that's a big chunk to come out of the budget, and it's only the second year of that, so it takes time for that to settle in.
Yeah.
So those are your big ones. I mean, our labor contracts are fair; they represent the value that our employees bring. But to be honest with you, they're not as substantial as many of our peer communities, people we're competing with. So everybody always looks at labor. I presented to the select board a breakdown of our staffing increases on the general government side, public safety, public works, general government.
Yes.
And you can see by looking at it that over the course of the last 5 years, we've not added a single full-time position. We've converted a few part-time. But so it's really just we reached the inflection point that because of our very good budgeting in prior years, we delayed, right? I said many of our neighbors have been seeing this conversation for 3 or 4 years. We delayed it. But we're at the point where we now need to make some tough decisions about, how we move forward and how we deliver the best product for our residents with the money that's available to us.
So if I'm a resident listening to this for the first time, Mr. Town Manager, are there areas where the town has already slowed growth or structural changes to control these costs?
Absolutely. I would say that for years we've been doing that in our staffing plan. Again, the presentation I gave to the select board on January 5th is available on the town's website. Look at that assessment, and it will show you that we've been very strategic about where, if at all, we've grown staff. On top of that, we've done a lot to look at efficiencies. We started 5 years ago. We joined with the town of Chelmsford to provide regional animal control. That saved us quite a bit of expenses. We've recently are so close to finalizing a regional veteran services deal with the town of Dracut, where they're going to eat half of our labor cost, and we're going to provide the same product to residents. So it's something that we look at in every decision that we make. What is tough about our situation is we already run such a lean budget. And I talk about, in the presentation, I talk about, quote, cushion. And I consider cushion anything in the budget that I can cut with zero impact to the level of service that residents have come to expect. None of that exists anymore. The only cushion we had up until this current budget was the general fund contribution to our roads program. We started at $50,000 5 years ago. We made it up to $300,000. That was the first thing I cut last year for this year's budget when I needed to balance it. So there's no more cushion because we run such a lean budget. We didn't add any positions using ARPA, which was that one-time infusion of federal funds.
Right.
We dedicated all of that to capital projects. So we've done all the right things, but when you look at the balance of Prop 2.5 with the cost of utilities, of maintenance, of salaries, we reached the inflection point that was inevitable and is inevitable for every municipality.
And just to kind of re-stress, when, state aid is uncertain, you've done all this, it seems like the town and, your leadership and finance, how do you budget responsibility when those numbers from the state, when you're sort of relying on that, right? You have your local revenues, but you also have the state revenue coming in. Those numbers aren't final until July. We're already in the next fiscal.
We do it by conservatively assuming what we're going to get. Our finance director presented a forecast 5 years out of what we anticipated on the revenue side, and we assume less than 1% increase on state aid year over year. And the reality is sometimes we get to 1%, sometimes you get to 1.25, but we assume the worst because then there's no mid-year surprises, right? The thing we try to do the most when we do our budget is prevent mid-year surprises. I'd rather make all of the tough decisions that we're going to make in the next couple of months now than be faced with a mid-year deficit because state aid didn't land where we wanted it or our excise taxes didn't come in as high. So it's simple. We just use an incredibly conservative approach leading up to the budget. And if you look in that same presentation, actually, it shows that we outperform our revenue projections every year. And people say, well, why don't you then just increase your revenue projections, right? If you've got this tremendous history of outperforming it, it all goes back to, again, wanting to avoid any mid-year surprises. Nobody predicted the pandemic, right? That struck in March. Budgets were already set at that point. If something like that were to happen again, I want to make sure that we are only expecting the bare minimum so that we're not facing a mid-year deficit and having to make, dramatic decisions midway through the year.
So we're kind of having this conversation like we know what we're talking about, obviously, but somebody listening in for the very first time, can you explain where does the town revenue come from? And you mentioned this whole predictability. And how predictable are those sources?
There are largely two sources of revenue. One is the levy limit. That's what is constrained by Prop 2.5. Think about the tax bill that you pay on the property you own in Tyngsborough. That represents the majority of our revenue. The second category is what we call local receipts. Those are things like your motor vehicle excise, cannabis excise, which is revenue that comes from the tax collected on the sale of cannabis products. Meals tax, anytime you eat at a restaurant in Tyngsborough. They're much smaller categories. So that first section, the levy, is incredibly predictable, right? We know that under state law, we're allowed to bill X dollars. And one way or another, we collect that same number. What is much harder to predict is the local receipts.
Okay.
What we do is a very collaborative process involving the assessor's office, the building commissioner, our economic development staff, finance director, and my office. We look at big projects that are in the queue. Can we expect that there will be substantial new growth in the next fiscal year? So when we were planning for Toll Brothers, which was the big 55-plus development on the old golf course, we knew that there were going to be years of positive new growth, hence the commitment to the middle school debt. What is challenging about that is that we have two really large projects in the queue that would tremendously increase not just our new growth, but our building permits. Unfortunately, there are things out of our control, largely around utility access, that make it incredibly difficult to predict when they'll be able to move forward. And so in those cases, we assume the worst, right? Because again, we don't want to be caught in a mid-year deficit. And we do that for every category. We look at trend data. So we look not just how far or how we're performing so far this year. We look back at how we were performing at this point over the last 3 years, and we use averages to figure that out. It isn't a science by any means. But it really requires a lot of data review, looking at averages, using your best judgment based on what you know. We're fortunate. We have a tremendous staff at Town Hall. Our assessor has a pulse on everything that's happening. So does our building commissioner. So there's a lot of human elements that we have to add into the equation. But that second half, the local receipts, is incredibly hard to predict. But again, I just want to emphasize that the way we've been doing it works because we far outperform every single year.
There's another component of this budget that, we've talked about the general services side. We're going to talk about the other portion, the schools. They take a huge chunk. It's one of the largest component of Tyngsborough's budget. How do you balance educational needs with the overall town affordability?
This is a question that literally divides communities. One of the things we're fortunate, we have a very good relationship with our school committee. I have a great relationship with my counterpart, the superintendent of schools, Dr. Flanagan. And I don't know anything about education except for that I graduated high school and I went to college and I know they got to hire teachers. But Dr. Flanagan knows it like the back of his hand. And so
right.
We've developed a system where They know what they need, and we do our best to accommodate. Now, nobody ever gets the part of the pie that they want, right? That's kind of the deal of compromising. We all have to share the same amount of money, and we've been very fortunate for the last several years. We've made it work. You're right, they represent the largest share of the budget. When you factor in that health insurance is on the town side of the budget, and they account for 87% of it, about 63% of the revenue we collect and the expenditures we make are school related. And it's expensive to run schools. They're facing the same challenges we are. Utilities, contracts, they've got union employees too. So a lot of it comes down to speaking. We've had meetings with them a couple times now. There's going to be a joint meeting, hopefully at the end of January, between the select board and the school committee. And it's really just figuring out, okay, what is the bare minimum both sides need to deliver the service that the community expects, and how do we get there? And so it's a lot of collaboration. And I think if you look at, there have been more public examples in other communities of falling outs or, really fighting over the pot of money. I think you see that it's largely due to a lack of collaboration. And again, we're incredibly fortunate in Tyngsborough. We have great collaboration. Dr. Flanagan and Joe Messina, who's their business administrator, have been incredible partners in figuring out how do we make this work. And I mentioned at the beginning that as a part of the proposal to get a new middle school, there was that agreement that there'd be a general fund contribution, and the school's set to a 5-year fixed increase. So it's all about working together and realizing that neither one of us is going to get as much of the pie as we'd like, but we make sure we get the bare minimum to deliver the services that we are expected to.
Right, and I know you're not an educator. You manage the general services size, but I ask the questions that people will likely ask you or not ask you. What do people most misunderstand when they hear school costs?
I think one of the things I point out about school costs is that there are a lot of challenges in the way that the state, and I hate to go back to the state, but there's a lot of challenges in the way that state funds education. Probably 5 years ago, there was a bill called the Student Opportunity Act, which our late state senator, Ed Kennedy, was instrumental in getting passed. And it did tremendous things for Chapter 70, which is education funding in cities. But what it did was it hurt the amount of funding that communities like Tyngsborough are receiving. If you had Dr. Flanagan or Joe Messina on, they could far better explain it. But we get less in state aid per student than many of our peers. So that's your first challenge, right? I go back to the state aid. The state is collecting more money every year than it needs to deliver the services it's delivering, and that needs to come back to the towns. The other thing is that it is really hard to predict certain aspects of the school budget. We talk at town meeting every year about the cost of special education or out-of-district placement. Those are things that are generally unanticipated. The law requires you provide all of the services that a student needs, which makes sense, right? We want to make sure our students have it. And so if halfway through the school year, you have a student that moves in that has needs that far outweigh the budget that you've prepared, somebody's got to eat those costs. So things like that make it really hard to predict, and thus make it hard to, balance a budget when there are just so many unknowns. And just your regular education population changes, right? People move in halfway through the year, people move out halfway through the year.
Right.
And how do you account for that in creating a budget, again, without minimizing the services or the activities that are available to students? It's a guessing game that I'm fortunate I don't have to play.
Looks like we'll need to have Dr. Flanagan and
Absolutely.
Messina come in and have that conversation with us. Another aspect of the budget is capital needs. How do those things show up, like public safety, equipment for DPW? How do they show up in the conversation?
Sure. Generally, those items are not included in the operating budget, which is what we're talking about today. The items, or the piece of it that is in the operating budget, is debt service. So a lot of times capital is funded one of two ways, either through free cash or through borrowing. It is very healthy, and it's actually advantageous for municipalities to maintain a healthy level of borrowing. It's kind of like your own personal life. You demonstrate your creditworthiness. It helps your bond rating. You want to carry, a proportionate amount of debt. And so we fund a lot of our capital through borrowing, which does show up in future years as debt service in the general fund. To be clear, the budget that I presented to the select board on January 5th did not include any new capital items for fiscal year 27, although I assume that will change. we anticipate that all of this year's capital will be funded through borrowing. We did the math. It's roughly $160,000 in debt service in year one. I got to whittle that $2 million number down before I put that in there. But that's how it shows up in the operating budget. It's through debt service. Now, if we were funding it 100% through free cash, you wouldn't see it in the operating budget. You would see it on town meeting because only town meeting can approve the use of free cash. But in the operating budget, you're seeing it in the form of debt service.
And free cash is not free. Free cash is?
Certainly not free. Free cash is money that was collected from residents, so somebody paid for it, that wasn't necessary to fund the current fiscal year's budget. So when I talk about us outperforming our revenue projections, any money that we collect that is considered, quote, surplus, plus any money that was appropriated by town meeting that we didn't spend, becomes free cash, which is certified by the Department of Revenue. Think of it as a savings account, if you will, or if you were in a business, you might consider it a profit. But you're right, it's not free. It came from taxpayers. And then town meeting gets to allocate it. In Tyngsborough, we've largely used that for capital items and to make deposits into our stabilization funds. What you want to avoid doing is using that to supplement the operating budget because it's one-time revenue. You can't count on it in future years.
Got it. Okay. Speaking of reserves and long-term planning, which you mentioned our finance director does, why should residents care about those things?
For a lot of reasons. One, it's their money, right? That's the most obvious answer that I can give. And I think one of the things we've done very well in our budget planning, particularly in the last 3 years, which is when I've been in charge of the budget, is making sure every step of the way residents understand that the importance of this conversation is we're talking about how spending their money.
Right.
Right? I mean, when I present a budget to the select board, I'm presenting my plan to spend the money that we collect from those 5 members, but also from the other 12,000 residents in Tyngsborough, 12,000 plus. So that's the first reason you should care. It also is a statement of our priorities, right? If I'm able to reinvest in public safety, that's because the community made clear that public safety is a priority, similarly with schools. There's also a down the road benefit to our proper financial planning in that it helps maintain the positive values that people have on their homes. If Tyngsborough was in financial ruins, you would see poor outcomes in our schools, right? If we're not funding it correctly, you got poor outcomes. That eventually means less people want to live in Tyngsborough, and so values come down. So it's all connected, but certainly there's no bigger argument of why you should pay attention to the budget than the fact that it's your money that we're spending.
When residents ask, what does this all mean for my tax bill? How do you honestly answer that?
100% of the money that we spend in the operating budget is paid through taxes of some form, whether it's your property bill or you went and ate at Epigram and a percentage of that was meals tax, or you registered your car in Massachusetts and Tyngsborough and we get the excise. And so what I would say is that, one, Tyngsborough has our tax bills are certainly not outrageous compared to our peers, right? We have a tax rate in Tyngsborough that is comparable to many of our peers. But what we're seeing is that a lot of the values on the homes in Tyngsborough are increasing. This year particularly, if you live on a waterfront property, your value probably went up substantially this year, which in the short term means you're paying more in taxes. Of course, in the long term, it means you could sell your house for more money. But what I hope people see is that for what they pay to the town, they're getting a equal or greater value in services. And, you know, I consider myself to be very much an open, you see it all the time, residents come in and talk to me all the time. I love talking to residents. I would love to hear from a resident who doesn't feel that way, because we want to change that. And there's no better time to change that than in the budget process. I'm sure we'll get to it at some point, but every year we host 3 different budget office hours. And that's not just an opportunity for me to show how we do the budget, what the budget means, how we're spending your money. It's also an opportunity for me to hear how you think we should be spending your money. Do you think we've overinvested in a specific category? Do you think we've underinvested? Because our budget is only as good as the amount of input that we get from residents, and that's why, you know, we go out of our way to make people understand that we're talking about your money.
Right.
In all these budget meetings today, when we sit here, we're talking about collectively the taxpayer in Tyngsborough's money, and so having their involvement is critical.
Have you scheduled the your show and tell?
I have scheduled the 3 budget office hours. They are, the dates are escaping me now, but if you go to tyngsborough.gov, you can find them all on the budget page, which is on the town manager's page. They're all in the end of March and early April.
And as you were giving your explanation, I was looking up our tax rate, which is $12.99 per thousand evaluation. And it's a single tax rate, single level. So that means residents and businesses alike pay the same level. Why is that?
It's a great question. Every year, the Board of Assessors has to, by law, appear before the Select Board and give them the option to switch to a split tax rate. You see a split tax rate certainly in cities and in larger communities. And when I say larger communities, I'm talking towns like Burlington, which are really commercially driven.
Yes.
In a town like Tyngsborough, where 87% of our tax base is residential, creating a separate higher tax rate for commercial business would actually have a negative effect in all likelihood. It would disincentivize commercial development, shifting more of the tax burden to residents. So when I say that, you can split the tax rate, no matter how you split the tax rate, the levy limit remains the same. So the town doesn't collect any less money if there's less commercial, right? The town collects the same amount of money. It's just splitting who's bearing the load. And so if you split it to bear the load more on commercial, you would just end up likely with less commercial. And so you're actually just shifting it right back to the residential anyway.
Huh. Okay. Well, I appreciate that explanation. So obviously what you presented earlier this month was an initial presentation. What happens next in the budget process between now and May?
As we speak, there are department heads back at Town Hall and across general government that are going through what I'm calling a zero expense budget workshop.
What does that mean?
So what we've said to departments is to start and to help us balance our side of the deficit, go through all of your expense lines, everything that you've proposed for next year, and zero it out. Drop it to zero. And then only add back in things that you have a contract signed today for. So think about our IT department, right? We use online software for all of our permitting. That's a contract that's signed. We're obligated to maintain it. So the fee for that will go back in. Once you've done that, we're meeting with department heads to justify every penny of additional expenses, because not everything that is necessary to run government is in a contract. For instance, our police and fire departments and DPW can't operate without gasoline.
Correct.
We don't have a gas contract, but we know that we need to. But before we add that back in, we'll look at 3-year averages. We'll look at, what are we doing to minimize the gas use? And I'm just using gas because that's a clear example. And so over the course of the next couple of weeks before January 26th, we will figure out how much we can save simply by this exercise. And I think it's a great reset no matter what our environment is, right? To understand, okay, well, for the last 3 years, I've budgeted X number of dollars for this program, but let me get creative. Can I do it for less? Can I combine it with another initiative? And so I'm actually optimistic that we'll find in the ballpark of $250,000 in savings just doing that. And then we got to wait to see how our conversation with the school committee goes. Right now, it's a moving target. I don't know if we'll land at a circumstance where the schools will have to find 63% of that deficit. That's a conversation I expect to take place at the joint meeting at the end of January. And then we'll have to have some more tough decisions. The demonstration I put in the presentation about staffing was to show that without cutting services that residents expect, I can't really just go through and eliminate positions to save money. So that's where we're starting. We're starting with the zero base. I think we can find a decent amount of savings in that. And then we got to figure out what we can do on the school side. We're continuing to lobby to the state for increased state funding. But as you noted earlier in the program, we won't know that final number till July, long after town meeting has met, set the budget, and adjourned. But there are immediate steps that we can take. Because again, I want this to be the takeaway of this. We will present a balanced budget to town meeting in May. Right? We have to. We will get there. But there are things we're doing now to help make those tough decisions so we can get to that point.
As we close out this conversation, what gives you the confidence about Tyngsborough financial health and financial future?
I think there's a few things. Again, I think that I'd point to the fact that we are now hitting this point, the inflection point that has been inevitable for every municipality. We're hitting it 3 years after our peers. So that makes me feel really good. We're also hitting it in the context of we threw a $900,000 non-operational expense in the operating budget, and we're still only hitting it this year. Think about that for 1 second. In year one, which was last year, we found $900,000 in the budget that didn't exist the year before to lower a debt exclusion. This is an unheard of thing. I've never heard of it happen in another municipality before.
Right.
So, yes, this year's tough. Make no mistake. But last year, we found $900,000 in the operating budget to reduce the tax burden of the middle school. So that gives me a lot of confidence. I think that by doing the exercise that we're doing today, going back to the drawing board, it's going to force us to rethink how we deliver some services and to find ways to deliver those same services at the same level or greater, but maybe with some cost savings. And again, if I'm proven wrong and next year is an even worse number, then we'll have to make some even more tough decisions. But Tyngsborough has a history of tremendously conservatively budgeting. You know, I don't think that I've been to a lot of town meetings. I've never heard someone stand up at town meeting and say, you know, this is an inflated budget. Certainly there are areas that people think we should invest more in. Roads is the biggest one.
Yes.
And there are probably areas people think we should invest a little less in. But I think all of that combined and the citizen participation. Watch our town meeting. Come to my budget office hours. People show up. People are interested.
They do.
And when you have the input of the community, when you have the community kind of overseeing the process, it really keeps things in perspective for you. And I think that's why we've been as successful as we've been. And again, we're in a deficit next year, projected deficit, right? Not a great place to be, but all things considered, we're still at a better advantage point than many of our peers are today or were last year or the year before.
Probably why we have effective town meetings.
Absolutely.
So, if residents can remember one thing from what we've talked about in the last half hour, what is it?
Get involved in the budget process. When we created the budget office hours, I did it because I knew that I do this full time. I get paid by the taxpayers to do this work. The average taxpayer doesn't have time in their day to study the intricacies of a municipal budget, to understand the intricacies of Prop 2.5, how we calculate new growth, how we forecast revenue. But they certainly know when they get their tax bill how much they're paying the town to deliver a service. So we created the budget office hours so that the average person who's raising a family, working, or just starting out in town can come and in a 45-minute informal, laid-back session, get an understanding of the budgeting process, see how we're spending their money, give us input on how to better spend their money, and feel better prepared to make suggestions at town meeting, to vote on this. We would go to town meeting, Rony, we would spend an hour and a half debating a zoning article about the placement of signs on commercial properties, an hour and a half. And then we'd get to the $50 million budget, and I truly believe, because not enough people understood it, it would pass in 6 seconds. We want people to ask questions. I don't have all the answers. I also don't have all the solutions, but you know who does? Somebody in town, right? And so we've really gone out of our way to get people involved, and when you get involved, when you understand how we spend your money, it all makes sense. It gives you a better vantage point to advocate for what you think is important or what you don't think is important. So that would be the takeaway, is get involved. We make it incredibly simple. I like to think that I'm approachable. My door is always open. I don't have an administrative assistant right now, so accessing me is even easier than it was before. But yeah, that's the takeaway, I think, is it's your money. It is your money. That's what I would call this episode.
Colin, I appreciate you walking us through this, and obviously we'll cover the budget process as it unfolds and make sure residents know how they can stay informed and involved.
I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to share this information.
That was Town Manager Colin Loiselle for the town of Tyngsborough. If you have questions about the budget, you can visit the town's website at tyngsboroughma.gov or feel free to reach out to his office. For the town of Tyngsborough, I'm Rony Camille, wishing you the best of goodbyes.